Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I am your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm the Director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Fresh off of our joint vacations, Rob Laherty joined me on the podcast for our weekly roundup on geopolitics and markets. There was no shortage of stuff going on in the world while we were away, but we talk about the euro approaching parity with the dollar, what that means for the future of Europe, some thoughts about China lockdowns and how that's effect on inflation, the global economy, and ending with some thoughts on Japan. As always, please write to me or to us, jacob@cognitive.investments, if you want to talk about anything, whether it's this podcast or what CI does or investing with us. You can hit me up at just about any time. Also, please remember to share this with your friends, to like us or rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen to. It is immensely helpful for us. We also have a YouTube channel, so if you want to listen to this on the background on YouTube for whatever reason, check us out there. Hoping to post some videos there too soon in the future. So without further ado, hope you guys had a great last week and a great weekend. Cheers. We'll see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Rob, I wish I was coming to you live from the Sri Lankan presidential residence pool, where I see everybody's been hanging out for the past week after storming it. But alas, I'm stuck in my office. It's nice to have you back.
Well, at least it's a nice new office.
Yeah, but it's not the Sri Lankan president's pool. It's always fun to see that stuff. It reminded me of when the protesters got into Gaddafi's house or one of his palaces or whatever. And this is Gaddafi's hat, and this is Gaddafi's scepter, and this is... Anyway, we're off to a great start. Rob, you're recently back from France. We thought we'd start off our return. There's so many things have happened in the last 2 weeks. There's so much to talk about. So we're going to try and keep things relatively focused on a couple topics. You just came back from France. There's some headlines about how the euro and the dollar are reaching parity for the first time in 20 years. Germany's trade surplus has evaporated. Boris Johnson is gone. There's no shortage of headlines in Europe. So why don't you at least first tell the listeners how France was and have you learned anything on the ground there that is useful for them to know?
Well, France was great. Although I'm suffering from the hangover today of having eaten crepes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a week, and now back on the routine, which is always hard.
You have a very, very difficult life. It's very difficult. I apologize.
It's tough. But overall, the parity between the dollar and the euro has been capturing all the headlines, and there's been a lot of talk about why that is. And it seems like the consensus is that because Europe is going into a deep recession. That's what I'm reading. And I would like to talk about that a little bit because I think that's an interesting topic to get into. So with regard to France specifically, I think there's some interesting stuff happening there. And it's interesting how in the US we tend to lump all these countries together. And when we talk about Europe, we often conflate what's happening in Germany with what's happening elsewhere. And it's a very different situation, as you alluded to, in talking about the German trade numbers and what's happening there. France is a different story, I think. And I found it interesting to actually be on the ground for the first time in a while and speak to people about what they're feeling, what they're seeing. And I came away, frankly, with a much more positive view than I would have if I were just sitting here looking at the Bloomberg terminal the whole week.
Why? So what did they tell you that made you a little more optimistic?
First, I think there's a perception that energy prices are just killing everyone and that households are getting squeezed just across the board in Europe. That doesn't seem to be the case. In France, at least, that was not a subject of conversation. And if you know French people, as I know that you do, they tend to complain. It's part of their, national heritage. And no one was complaining about energy. Even when I asked them and prompted, they would say, "Oh yeah, sure. We read about it. It's probably an issue." But no one is sitting there making that a big deal in everyday conversation. So that was a surprise. The other surprise was just thinking again about these differences between Germany and France and Italy and the more Mediterranean countries. Tourism is booming, absolutely booming right now. When I go, I like to read the little regional newspapers. So there's France West. That's the front page is some serious article about what's going on in national politics, and then it's a piece about like who won the cutest dog contest in the little village next door. Is that kind of thing. And there was an article in there over the weekend where they interviewed the head of the SNCF, the French train system. And he said that train ticket sales this summer were up 10% against 2019 levels, which is really, really big. And I asked a lot of people when we were in Paris, what they were seeing in terms of tourism volumes and things like that. And they were very bullish. Everyone said that the tourism numbers were off the charts, and you can just feel it. Just walking around the city, it is packed, and it was packed in Brittany and the countryside as well. And I was with extended family of my wife's, and it's not a very touristed part of Brittany where we go. Brittany is sort of like Cape Cod for French people, for those who don't follow these things. So it's very popular to go there in the summer, but in certain places more than others. So we were out in Finistère, which you can actually take a run from where we were, and you are in the westernmost point of France, which is kind of cool. And it's all locals. It's not a huge tourist destination because there's not much to do there. And it was absolutely hopping everywhere you went. Bars, restaurants, people outside drinking with their families. There was a sense of energy and optimism that you could get from just speaking to people as well. And it's interesting to observe because, you forget tourism is 8 or 9% of France's GDP, which for a big country like that is huge. Greece is 12%, but Greece is tiny in terms of population and in terms of its real economy. I mean, France is a major industrial economy, and it's 9%. So that's having a big impact. And that was something that had been really depressed for the prior few years. What else? Gas prices are $8 a gallon there.
It's not so surprising to me that the French would be less concerned about energy prices, though. There's been a lot of news about how their nuclear sector has been underperforming, and that power generation from nuclear reactors, I think it's something like dropped 15% year over year, and 12 of their 56 reactors are offline, which when I read things like that, I feel like I'm in New Orleans, where they tell us, the water pumps that we just spent billions of dollars renovating, they're all offline right when the hurricane hits. I sort of feel that way if their reactors are off right in the middle of the Russia-Ukraine war. But for all of the bad things in Russia's nuclear sector, they still get something like 60 or 70% of their electricity from nuclear. Like, they are not tied to Russia the same way that Germany is. I mean, Germany made a fairly large bet on Russia, and the reason things are going bad in Germany right now, there's been a lot of headlines about how Germany posted this negative monthly trade deficit for the first time in 30 years. And it's absolutely shocking to think that Germany, the country that exports BMW and Mercedes and this, that, or the other thing, they're importing more than they're exporting. But if you actually look at the figures, like, yes, their exports are down a little bit, but it's really the cost of imports has risen. So it's not like Germany has stopped exporting or that the economy has collapsed. It's just that they made a very bad strategic bet on Russia. And if energy prices go up, like, Germany's going to feel that. So it's not quite that the sky is falling, but I do think you're absolutely right that we're in the situation where Germany and any other country that bet on Russia as a source of cheap energy, it's going to be very difficult. And France is the largest country in Europe that didn't really make that bet, because Italy made that bet too. I mean, they're really sitting in a pretty good position right now, even though I saw that the French prime ministers, they're talking about completely nationalizing the electric utility there. So that might have something to do with it. I wonder if they can translate that into leadership in the bloc, because it looks like the bloc is going to need some leadership here fairly soon.
Yeah, and I looked up the numbers from last week in anticipation of this, just to see what that mix was. You mentioned the nuclear being 60 to 70%. So that's exactly right. So last week, nuclear represented 63% of France's electricity generation. Gas was only 11%, and solar was 12%, which I found surprising. Yeah. There's a seasonal element in there, I'm sure, because these are numbers from last week, and it's summertime and no cloudy gray skies, and they're having a heat wave. But still, that's a big number.
No, they've been able to. They made a strategic decision, and it's paid off for them. But it does. I think it does actually give France an opportunity. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about energy the last couple of weeks for a lot of different reasons. But when you go back in history at these moments of general transition, whether it's geopolitical or economic or in the context of wars, it's usually the countries that have access to energy cheaply and reliably that do the best. I mean, France has a lot of issues, and I mean, Macron is going to be dealing now with he doesn't have his absolute majority, so he's not going to be able to do some of the things that he wants to do. But France, relative to most of the other European countries, is in a fairly strong position. I mean, contrast them with what seems to be happening in Italy, where we're about to get, well, I don't want to say that we're about to get another government collapse, because I think some of this is probably the five-star movement is just tired of being left out in the cold. But, you know, Italy, like Germany, has bet big on importing Russian energy, and they're learning that that's not such a good bet.
And yet, earlier this week or last week, the retail sales numbers in Italy came out, and I was shocked at how strong they were. So in May, I think these were the May numbers, so maybe this is outdated now, but retail sales were up 1.7% month over month and 7% year over year in Italy, which I think probably has something to do with the return of tourism, but still, it doesn't match the extremely pessimistic commentary that you hear, at least on this side of the pond. Like, just to clarify, Europe is not in a recession. I mean, if you look at the data, even the most recent data that's just come out in the last few weeks, they're not in recession yet. There's a slowdown happening, especially in Germany. But it's a little premature to write them off in such a way.
Well, and it's also fun. I'm glad you mentioned that, because we started talking about the Euro-Dollar Parity, and maybe we circle back there now that we've hit some of the main European states. But if you look back and see when the last time the euro and the dollar sort of flirted with parity, it was right after the European sovereign debt crisis and Grexit, and people were wondering about whether the future of the European Union, if it had a future to begin with. It seems to me that usually when the euro declines, it's doubts about Europe as an entity going forward. Like, yes, there was a sharp drop after the 2008 financial crisis. Yes, there was a sharp drop sort of after the dot-com bubble burst, but then usually the euro goes back up. And the only time it's had those sustained lulls in value against the dollar is when people are concerned about the future of the European Union. And let's even say, like, maybe Europe is headed for recession. Like, maybe we're already in it and the data hasn't reflected it yet, or maybe we're going there because the Russians are not going to give up anytime soon. Like, let's just grant the argument that it's in recession. It doesn't seem to me that should be the thing that sends the euro down. It seems to me that what's happening here is that there is some doubt about whether the European Union is going to be able to maintain cohesion and stability, and that there is some doubt about, and we talked about this in the context of China, I think the last time we were on the podcast, but this sort of delinking of the direction of the major global economies. And if the U.S. is really going to hike interest rates after that big inflation print, and Europe is afraid to do that because of the higher energy prices. Is that one of the reasons that the euro is down? So I rambled a little bit there, but I wonder what your thoughts are coming out from that more optimistic view of why the market is telling us, no, that the euro is going down and it should go down more. And I mean, we're long the euro right now. We're positive on the euro long term, so it's specifically relevant for us.
Yeah. This is a particularly interesting juncture for the euro because unlike those other periods like 2012, when a lot of that was driven by concerns over the survivability of the Eurozone itself and all of those sovereign related issues, I don't think that that's the case now. And I think this goes back to what we talked about a few weeks ago in our piece on geopolitics plus investing, where we looked at the divergence in policy across the major economic regions of the world. And I think this is a vicious consequence of that, because what's happened is the euro, started pushing toward parity in the last week as U.S. interest rates went higher, and this U.S. inflation print came in higher than expected. Short-term rates jumped. The 2-year U.S. Treasury yields went to 3.2%, which is higher than the 10-year Treasury yield. So everyone has talked about this and the inversion of the yield curve. And the Fed has basically come out and put 100 basis points, a 1% interest rate increase on the table for the next meeting, which is extraordinarily large. So that has happened against the background of rates in the Eurozone are 0% today. For all the talk of raising and, taking putting your foot on the brake, that's the reality right now, 0%. And the 2-year German Bund yield by comparison is 0.55% compared to 3.2% in the US. So I think a lot of what you're seeing is simply flows chasing the interest rate differential. And as that differential widens and widens, the currency is the pressure release valve for that. Now, the interesting thing is what happens beyond the short term, because in the US, as we said, the yield curve has gone into inversion. So the 10-year yield has dropped in the last few weeks, and the long-term bonds are firming up, which to me suggests the markets are looking past the short term, what the Fed is going to do, and saying, this is really going to slow things down. And we talked about that in our last discussion, so we don't go over it again. But if you take that and you compare it to the Eurozone, getting to what some of the things we were saying here, and the longer term outlook and implications, I think you can make a fairly bullish case on Europe, because the U.S. is coming off of the biggest fiscal stimulus we've ever had. And that's really a big part, the biggest part of why we've experienced inflation here. By contrast, Europe is moving in the opposite direction. So Germany's spending on arms and military modernization. France has a pretty significant stimulus program that is rolled out to help cushion the blow of higher energy prices on households. They're stimulating their economies. They're looking to invest, and they are the ones who feel this sort of existential need to do something, which is really important. And just getting to the anecdotes and the on-the-ground kind of sanity check again, you can feel that in the air. So, this is a little biased because I was in a part of France that's very eco-conscious, very sort of left-wing in that regard. But the conviction that there needs to be sort of a new basis for the economy, that Europe needs to be independent in terms of energy, that they need to overhaul a lot of fundamental underpinnings of the way the economy works, and this requires investment. That conviction is only deepened given everything going on from the environmental standpoint. And the other anecdote that I found interesting, so I went for I went for an hour and 15-minute run with my brother-in-law, who works. He's connected with the French military. And poor guy, his English is not great. And we went for this long run, and he spoke English the whole time, so he was just suffering in both directions. But it was interesting because they're very bullish in the defense community there. And a lot of what he spoke about was, what France is doing to build out greater capabilities, to build out capabilities in drone warfare, perceived threats in the Mediterranean. What are they doing to respond to Russia? So these are just little anecdotes, but this notion that things must be done, that investments must be made, that the future must be met, that exists there in a way that, we're fumbling a bit here to find a vision.
Yeah. And to your point about anecdotes, I mean, the one thing about the CPI print, which is amazing to me that people don't talk about when they talk about the inflation, 9.1% year on year. And yes, it's very high in energy, 41%. But that data is a month old. So they're giving us the data for June. So the data that we're getting on the CPI print, yes, it's the fourth consecutive month of a rise. Yes, it's more than people expected. Although I don't know who these people are who are making estimates. I'm pretty sure I would increase my estimate if I was wrong 3 months in a row, but whatever. But that was before, like the bottom fell out of energy prices here, or especially oil prices here at the beginning of the month. So I don't want to call top here, but I mean, I was driving down the street here and I saw sub $4 gasoline, which I haven't seen for like quite a while. And it's kind of strange to me to hear the Fed whispering and to see the 100 basis point hike enter into the media discourse when it feels like in some ways they've already smacked the thing and the thing is beginning to roll back a little bit. But aside from that, I just wanted to ask you what is your timing then on the euro itself? Because it sounds like there's probably going to be an opportunity in there somewhere. But as we're seeing with the yen right now, people can chase the interest rate differential for a while. And no matter how dumb I think the Fed is, the Fed thinks it knows better than me. And they're talking about 100 basis points. So maybe we're going to get 125. Who knows? So it seems like people can chase that for a while and that there might be more pain in store for the euro. Do you feel like that's right? Or do you like this parity level? Do you like this psychological one-to-one level and think we bounce from here?
Well, let me first, before getting into timing, address the issue of the Fed being wrong, because I think that's an important theme to remember, which is that the Fed is always wrong. And so is the ECB. And I don't mean that to be glib, but the Fed is a committee, and a committee must act when something has become obvious. And it's the same thing with investment committees. That's who we're up against. We have a small boutique firm where we can make decisions in a pretty flexible and adaptable manner. But I've worked at firms where everything goes through an investment committee. And let me tell you, the committee doesn't do something until that's obviously the thing you should do. And once it's obviously the thing you should do, it's obvious you should be doing the opposite. So in many ways, you're measuring in interest rate policy between the Fed and the ECB, who's more wrong. And I think my theory would be that the Europeans are more wrong, because not only do they have a committee like the Fed does, but they have a committee representing many different countries with many different, philosophies and historical backgrounds and interests and things like that. And historically, that's kind of how it's played out. Like, look back at 2007. Remember, I don't know if you remember this. At that time, the ECB was the hawkish one. So energy prices were spiking. Jean-Claude Trichet was raising interest rates into the teeth of an impending recession. And they were the hawkish ones, and that was a mistake. And the euro was pushing all the way. I think it hit 150. I'd have to look at the chart before it absolutely shit the bed, if you pardon my expression. And I wonder if we're seeing something similar here. Rates are 0% in the Eurozone right now. And they're coming out and saying, well, the energy thing is probably transitory. The underlying, they're terrified because of everything that's happened in the interim, because of the 2012 secular stagnation. Europe's so old, they're never going to invest in anything ever again. It's going to fall apart. All of these ghosts are haunting them. And I just wonder if they're making a similar mistake in the opposite direction, where they should be raising interest rates because things are changing. Like we just talked about, the Eurozone is investing. And there's a reason to invest where there was not one before, and all of these things. And that as that realization eventually happens, that's when you have Christine Lagarde come out and say, hey, we think the sustainable level of interest rates in Europe is higher than it was 5 years ago. That would absolutely shock everybody. But that's not happening yet. So on the timing thing, that's a different sort of question, because a lot of that is just observing how markets react. So we have a small position in Europe right now. We're not betting the farm on it by any means. And I'm hesitant to increase that just yet. But I think the thing that I focus on is, if long-term interest rates in the US were following the short end of the curve higher, I would be much more concerned about our Europe position. And if forward measures of inflation in the US weren't falling in line with commodity prices, instead of rising in line with the, contemporaneous CPI inflation print, that would make me much more worried about timing. But both of those things are doing the opposite. Forward inflation expectations are falling. The long-term bond yields are falling. Commodity producer stock prices are getting whacked. The copper price just dropped below $3.20 a pound. If you remember, we were here a month ago when I was saying, copper just fell to $4.20 per pound. So that's a big drop. Look at what's happened in the interim. That is a huge decline. Those things, I think, tell you that the timing is not going to be long before markets start to recognize that divergence is peaking.
Yeah. The other part with copper, though, is, that's where China kind of enters the picture here. And it looks like we're heading to another round of lockdowns in China. And I was in Wisconsin earlier this week, and the first question I got from the audience was, do you think that they're going to continue to do the zero COVID thing? And I said, yes, absolutely. They say they are. And if they say they are and they keep doing it, I think there was a brief reprieve in commodity prices there because people thought that China was going to get back on track. But if they can't get this new variant now under control, it seems like they're going to shut things up as well. So but again, that's another sort of depressant, another sort of thing that should cool off the economy a little bit, I would think.
And yet Chinese equity prices are not making new lows, which I think is an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, well, that's because people they won't listen to the Chinese government when they say we're doing zero COVID. They think that they're not going to do that. But I think people have started looking at the sheer amount of stimulus that is coming out of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're realizing, they are not going to let these companies collapse as a result of this. It's very different than the Evergrande stuff that was happening earlier this year, where that was, the real estate bubble was an example of companies that did things sort of against what the Chinese Communist Party wanted. Now we're dealing with a COVID situation where companies that did everything that the Chinese Communist Party told them to do were also suffering. And you can see that the Chinese government is coming to their rescue. If they're going to choose between stability and prosperity, they're going to try and have both. They're going to try and shut it down so that the healthcare system doesn't get overwhelmed. And they're going to fire the bazooka at the problem and hope that, as it has in previous times, they're going to be able to keep afloat until this passes.
Well, let me ask you a question or your opinion on something. Because in the last week, since I came back, I was out of the flow for a week, eating crepes. And when I got back, two data points really stuck out to me about China. And the first was these protests by the bank depositors, which I'm sure you saw. Mm-hmm. And the other one was people speculating, or not speculating, people observing who were in places like Shanghai, that there was a huge level of ill will and frustration and annoyance on the part of people in Shanghai and some of these places that have been repeatedly locked down and have been treated, in a way that they perceive as being very unfair. And do you think that has any meaningful impact, or is it just the kind of part of the constant bubble, which is, local dissent, local protests in China that always happen?
Yeah. So on the first one, I mean, that's the sort of situation where I feel less confident about my take, because you really do have to be on the ground and understanding people, and that's just not possible right now. That would have been hard even pre-COVID and pre-multipolarity and the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, but it's just getting harder and harder to get kind of actual ground truth there, and you never know when stories are being blown out of proportion. Because to your point, if you look at a map of if you looked at a map of protests in China the past 6 months, you'd be gobsmacked, because like everything is bigger in China. Sorry, Texas, but it really, they just do things on a much grander scale, and they have protests all the time. It's still a developing economy, especially when you get into some of these rural hinterlands and things like that. So the idea that a bank in this province is not, people are afraid about getting paid back from, I forget what the exact issue was that they were protesting, but the protests themselves don't mean that much to me. And if they're not lining the streets and the security agencies aren't being overrun, it kind of takes that to start getting me to pay attention. So I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying, based on the information I have, I don't have enough to feel that concern. So I'm sort of in a wait and see thing. On Shanghai, I mean, that's the place where you still do have Westerners running around, and they are frustrated with China's COVID-19 policies, in part because in the rest of the world, we've given up on managing COVID-19. And here again, I would just say, it's hard to get into the Chinese government psyche, but here's my best guess. I don't think it's a conspiracy to drive up inflation in Western markets. I think what we're dealing with here is a Chinese government that has a population of, 800 million only children, or however many, the one-child policy was 1970, 1980. So you've got multi-generations of kids who they're the only child and they have two parents, and it's a society that is kind of traditional and deferential to elders in the first place. You've also got a fairly poorly developed healthcare system. They don't have a good COVID-19 vaccine, and nobody's been willing to give them the COVID-19 vaccine. That goes to our whole multipolarity conversation. So if you're Xi Jinping, the two things that the Chinese Communist Party has been built on is maintaining stability in society and making sure people are having more prosperity. And you're sort of stuck between these two things, because if you shut down the economy, you're hitting the prosperity plank. But if you just let things go and let COVID run rampant, I'm not convinced that China has a healthcare system that wouldn't be completely overwhelmed. And if everybody's parents are dying in the street, and this is also an interesting thing, Chinese old people seem to not be willing to take the vaccine, just like in the rest of the world. So China's propaganda seems to be great at a bunch of other things, but then when the Chinese government says, please take the vaccine, nobody's taking the shitty vaccine that they have in the first place. So when you put all that together, that tells me that the Chinese Communist Party is saying, you know what, of these two threats, lockdowns and people complaining to Bloomberg and Shanghai versus we could have our healthcare system overrun and have all these kids lose their parents because we said we were great at COVID and then we weren't. I think they look at that latter scenario and say, okay, that we can't allow, and we at least have tools on the prosperity front to maintain people, to have stimulus, to try and stimulate the economy, even as we have these lockdowns to try and protect what's going on from a healthcare perspective. They're fighting an uphill battle, because if they don't have a vaccine and you're going to have all these variants and the rest of the world is just doing whatever it wants, you're going to get more and more variants, and they're just going to have to continue shutting down. But I think that's where they're stuck. They're stuck between the stability, prosperity, hard place. And my guess is that Xi thinks, I would rather not have all these people die from COVID if it's within my power to prevent it, because that's an existential threat. That's what I'm working off of, and it's my best guess, but it's a guess.
And how does that resolve itself? Does this just continue for the next 2 years, or does something break or get resolved along the way?
I mean, they can keep it up for a long time. I think there's a lot of stimulus in the system, and I think there's probably patience from society at large. Not everybody's complaining to Bloomberg. I think the people that are complaining to Bloomberg represent a small fraction of the people in China. But there have been little signs that the U.S. and China are talking about trade again. And the Biden administration has shown just in the last month or two, it's turning on some policy priorities that it had before. I mean, Biden's going to be in. We're recording on Thursday. I can't remember if he gets to Saudi Arabia today or tomorrow, but he's going to say hello to MBS and sort of eat crow there. He's been very tough on China, but there's been reports of discussions between the U.S. and China on trade. So, I mean, if I was Xi Jinping, I would be looking for what trade concessions can I give that gets me access to the latest cutting edge vaccines. And then how do I get those vaccines into China, and how do I claim credit for it? And how do I get to some level of stability where my healthcare system is not overrun, but I can open up and I can, they call it the dynamic zero COVID policy. It's mostly a zero COVID policy right now. They need enough healthcare tools to where they can have it be dynamic, where they can keep things open and not have to go to this continual shutdown thing. So, I mean, that's what I would be thinking if I was them, but I'm obviously not them. And there's a lot of concern and suspicion on all sides, but that's what I would be looking for. Some level of cooperation, coordination, quid pro quo. We need this, you need this. Let's work together on this particular thing in a limited way and try and start rebuilding trust. I also, though, I mean, as I'm saying that, like, that sounds almost wildly optimistic and naive, because like we should have been doing that from the beginning of the pandemic. If we'd done that in December 2019, we probably wouldn't have a pandemic in the first place. So at a certain point, these geopolitical things get zero sum, and what makes sense is not what people do.
Not to shift too far, but keeping it within Asia, I've been dying to ask you, and I read, I believe your focus piece in this week's Global Situation Report is probably going to be on Abe, if I read your notes on our internal knowledge platform right. But I'd love to hear your commentary on that, and how important is this to Japan's trajectory, the Abe assassination?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not often shocked geopolitically. Like, my job is to sort of imagine like all the possibilities. So, like, for instance, I didn't think Russia was going to invade Ukraine. I was not shocked that Russia invaded Ukraine. That was certainly within the universe of the possible. The idea that Shinzo Abe would be gunned down at a campaign rally is truly shocking. And I also, I'm a little just a minor rant about and this says something about media coverage of Japan in general, which I've always complained about, because there's just not a lot of it. The way that the U.S. media went straight to, and this is all about gun laws. Japan has really strict gun laws, and even then they had the homemade gun. Like, it was very strange that we weren't actually talking about the fact that probably the most important Japanese politician since Hirohito. I shouldn't call Hirohito a politician, the emperor, the godhead of Japan. But one of the most important figures in Japanese political history just got gunned down in the street. Maybe we should talk about what that means for Japan and what's going on in that country. I will say, like, it doesn't seem like there was any foreign influence behind the assassination. I see that people have been pointing out that on Chinese social media, there's been some celebration over his death. I would point out that Xi Jinping put out a very heartfelt sort of statement talking about all of his work with Abe over time. And, social media is a cesspool. So this idea that you're going to go on social media and say, oh, some people are saying nasty things. Like, I guarantee you people are saying nasty things about everything on social media. So let's not blow it out of proportion. But it doesn't look like there was any foreign influence behind the assassination. It doesn't even look like there was any kind of domestic Japanese political faction against him. It looks like that he was gunned down by a crazy dude who blamed Abe for his mom giving all her money to a religious organization or something like that. And the reason that's important is because now we're just talking about, okay, so what does this event do to Japanese society? And we had an immediate barometer, because the reason Shinzo Abe was out campaigning was because there was a election 2 days after he was killed for the Upper Diet. And his party did great. And they did so great that they might, with their coalition allies, they might have the majority they need to do all the things Abe was never quite able to do as prime minister. He wanted to change the constitution and make it not pacifist. He wanted Japan to be more muscular. He wanted, Abenomics and more innovation and more growth and things like that. And he did a lot of it, but he wasn't able to do all of it. And I'm wondering if you're going to get this kind of thing that happened in the U.S. after Kennedy, which was Kennedy had all these grand ideas, all these reforms, animated a generation, couldn't get any of it done because there just wasn't enough power. He didn't have enough power to do so. And then when he gets assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson comes in, you get that sort of swell of support and sympathy, and then he rams civil rights down the pike, and he rams all these things that Kennedy was never able to do because he has that moment. I'm wondering if that's where we're at with China. And I feel like you and I are always waiting for the moment where Japan turns or Japan wakes up. That's what I'm watching for. I'm wondering if this moment is going to be the moment where Japan wakes up. The only other thing, and then I'll stop talking about Abe, is that at the foreign policy level, he was a far-sighted statesman. He was the one who proposed the Quad in 2006, 2007 in the first place. For the listeners, the Quad is the really poorly named initiative that is supposed to be some kind of loose alliance between Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. And he proposed it back in 2006, 2007, and he was basically laughed out of the room. The Australians replaced their government the year after he proposed it and decided they wanted to try and trade more with China. India was non-aligned. The United States was open to the idea of the Quad, but then the 2008 financial crisis happened and they needed to coordinate with China and they didn't want to piss China off. Fast forward a decade and suddenly the Quad is back. And now the Quad meets once or twice a year, and it's this emerging alliance, and China's worried about it being the Asian NATO. That's all Shinzo Abe. He started that. He was the one who put the strategic heft behind it. He described the need for it, and he did it before 2008, before even people like me were talking about a multipolar world and all of these things that happened. So those are my initial thoughts on Abe. Where do you want to dive in a little bit more?
Well, I'm going to ask you a question that's impossible to answer, which is...
my favorite kind.
Yeah. I mean, it was in the 1930s that Japan experienced its most, famous and consistent series of political assassinations, as right-wing radicals eliminated anyone who was more moderate or, not sufficiently zealous in the cause and things like that, understanding completely that this individual who did assassinate Abe appears to have been a very unique case with this religious group and, a particularly deranged individual person. How much scope is there for this to inspire a similar wave of activity like that? Because, one of the things that always strikes me about Japan, as I study it as an outsider who, is coming from a very different place, is that you have this very traditional view in the U.S. of Japan as being this very kind of calm and, level-headed place, and they're very meek, and, society's very polite, and, all of those sort of stereotypes. And yet at the same time, you can, if you spend a little bit of time looking, you see there's, right-wing groups that are, doing unauthorized parades and blasting music. And that stuff to some extent has never gone away. Do you think that this has any bearing on that, or is this purely a piece of noise or a one-off incident?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because I can get back on my soapbox for a second, because this was another thing that bothered me in the coverage of this. Everybody was exactly right. In every single English media article you could find about this assassination. Oh, I can't believe this happened in Japan. Japan is so stable. They've never had anything like this. And it's read a little bit of history. Japanese politics, not even 1930s, go back all the way. It's incredibly violent. It's incredibly bloody. This used to happen all the time. Just because they don't have guns doesn't mean they're not killing each other with samurai swords or whatever else they had on hand at the time. So the real aberration is this period from 1945 until now in Japanese history, in part because they were defeated in a major war, and the United States, a foreign country, came in and gave them a constitution. That's part of what Abe was working against. He wanted Japan to kind of rise itself. I would also just say that I've been reading on vacation, and now I'm slowly making my way through this biography of Douglas MacArthur. And just as all this happens, I'm just getting to the point where MacArthur has been appointed to rebuild Japan and really be the political figure who's rebuilding Japan. And he's talking about the Japanese psyche and writing letters about it and giving speeches about it in ways that today would seem racist, but which he was absolutely right about. I mean, he wanted to keep the emperor in power. He sort of understood what Japan was like and what Japan was going to need in order to grow and evolve beyond that. And I would also just say on the right-wing thing, yes, all societies have right-wing groups. We just talked about the social media gutter in China. I had an Israeli cab driver once who said to me the English translation is, in every house there is a trash can. So every house like has their right-wing stupid political parties. I don't see that Japan is going back to the 1930s moment at all. I don't see any like political factions that are emerging against Abe or pro. Like there seems to be none of that infighting. The 1930s was also about a clash between the military and between the political class. There had just been rapid industrialization. Japan was also conquering territories abroad. There was a fight for glory there, and who's going to get to enjoy the spoils. There was all of that was going on. That's not what's happening in Japan. In Japan, it looks like the LDP is now going to consolidate political control, and Abe's vision for the country is going to move forward. So it actually doesn't look like the 1930s to me at all. It seems like maybe Japan is going to unite around a vision of its future and push in that direction sort of single-mindedly. So it's more like the thing I'm watching for is this a Meiji restoration moment more than is this a 1930s cloak and dagger samurai or cloak and samurai sword, assassinations happening left and right. I don't think that's going to happen, but we should watch. I mean, one of the newspaper articles that I flagged when I was reading Japanese press for the last week was there was one death threat called in one of the local elections in Japan for a Japanese politician, and I stopped and I saved that one. So if we're wrong, we'll know pretty soon if Japan is going to return to that level of political instability. But I don't think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed towards a real consolidation for the LDP, and we'll see what they can do with it.
And how much ability politically do you think that they have to do what? You know what I mean? Like, what is your base case assumption for if that thesis is correct and you have renewed impetus behind constitutional reform and a lot of the other things on Abe's wish list, what does that realistically look like a few years from now if it gets implemented?
Well, one of the most interesting things here is what this means for Japan's relationship with China, because, excuse me, I just had to. One of the reasons that I find Abe so fascinating is because he was the guy behind the Quad. He wanted this sort of Japan as part of a broader security alliance with China being the obvious target, and yet in 2018 and 2019. He was reaching out to Xi Jinping, and he went to Beijing in 2018 and tried and play up the friendship between China and Japan. And Xi was supposed to come to Tokyo in 2020 for the first Chinese state visit in a long time, and he didn't come because of COVID. But Abe seemed to be trying to play both sides there. So he wanted some kind of alliance network, but he didn't want to lose economic relations with China. I mean, even in the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was trying to conquer parts of China because it knew that it needed the economic benefit from holding those parts. But it doesn't look like Japan, and I think if you're being realistic and you're pragmatic, if you're Japan, China's too big. You're not going to isolate them and just keep them caged in the South China Sea forever. You're going to have to find some way to deal with them. And that, I think, all comes down to some level of deterrence. So I don't think Japan realistically can get to a place where it's like, the 1930s again, and they're running around conquering most of Southeast Asia, and it's a new Japanese empire. But what they do need to be able to do is have enough of a deterrent factor with China that China takes them seriously, and not just the United States seriously, but takes Japan seriously and thinks that it has to work with Japan somehow and treat Japan. I don't think China will ever treat Japan as an equal just because of all the historical baggage there, but is not willing to just steamroll Japan or take some of these islands that are disputed between them. So, I mean, I would think it means things like stronger military alliances with Japan as a focal point. Japan's going to need to invest in energy self-sufficiency and security and things like that. Maybe nuclear weapons for Japan. I don't know if you want to depend on the U.S. nuclear umbrella ad nauseum. I could see that sort of thing emerging. You're going to have to, if Taiwan is really as important to Japan as it says, and Abe was one of the most outspoken, one of the things he was doing in the last year or two, even out of office or out of the prime ministership, I should say, was talking about how critical it was for Japan to defend Taiwan. So if you really mean that, well, you're going to have to arm them. You're going to have to figure out some kind of diplomatic, economic, security structure that keeps China out of there. So those are some of the areas that I would watch for. In some ways, the Constitution question, I mean, it's a nice it would be a nice have for the LDP, especially to say that they followed through on Abe's vision. But I mean, in practice, Japan's been behaving as if it's that like they're going to double the size of the military by 2026, probably, I think, or the size of the military budget. I mean, they've already kind of been doing these sorts of things. So it kind of looks like now, but more would be my guess.
Do you think that China fears Japan?
That's a good question. I don't know. And I'm neither Chinese nor Japanese, so that either makes me perfect to answer the question or completely incapable of answering the question. I think the first way I would answer that question is my guess is that China does not like Japan and that they have memories of what happened. I don't think the memory of World War II and all the really, and we should say really awful things Japan did to China in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, they were terrible. And this actually, you were talking about, Japan seems meek and things like that in the media. This goes back to some of the things that MacArthur was writing about even in the late 1940s. Like, even in Japan itself, they are fascinated themselves by their own national character to where they can be completely angry and completely filled with emotion and rage and irrational and just kind of go all in, especially in the areas that they conquered in the 1930s and 40s. And then a year later, they can snap back and be perfectly, oh yes, like please, like we're now on the same plane. So they have this sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing to them. But yeah, I don't think China has forgotten the 1930s and the 1940s. And resents Japan for that, and in particular resents Abe's particular style of politics, because Abe was never really contrite about what Japan did back then. That was part of his nationalist thing. But I don't think China has anything to fear from Japan anymore. It's not like Japan can march into Manchuria and take over like they did in the early 1900s. I mean, this version of China is incredibly strong and would kick Japan's ass if it tried to do that. So I don't think it's fear, but I think it's mistrust, suspicion. There's probably some hatred, not wanting to be a junior figure, not wanting to be told what to do. And I mean, all of that is impelled by fear and not wanting to repeat the past. But there's no reason for China today to fear Japan in that sense. It's more about maintaining their position and about the mistrust and suspicion between them. That's my best answer, but within the limitations of my own worldview there.
And just to push that a little further, because I'm curious, do you think, because everyone talks about China-Taiwan conflict and obsesses over the risk of that, and you've addressed that elsewhere and said, recently that you think people are overestimating the likelihood of that conflict in the near term, at least. Do you think that generally the consensus underestimates the risk of conflict between China and Japan, however low that may be? And let me flesh that out a little bit before you answer, because one of the things that I think about a lot with regard to Japan is I think there's a general misperception in the West of Japan and sort of the balance at work there. And we talked about the stereotypes about meekness and, the old Dave Chappelle joke that in the Iraq War, Japan's sending PlayStations, and, that's the perception. But if you really look at Japan and its perception of itself, and this is my opinion or observation, and it's, I don't want to get in trouble here. You can see the elements for potential problems there. And what I mean is, unlike Germany, which is obsessed with the national memory of what it has done, and that's such a part of its DNA now as a nation, is how do they respond to that? I don't think Japan has ever really recognized publicly, certainly not publicly, but I don't think there's even a general awareness of what Japan has done in the past, particularly with regard to Korea and China. And I think the story that the Japanese tell themselves is primarily one of victimhood and not one of remorse around the dropping of the atomic bombs primarily. And just as an example of that, did you see The Wind Rises, the more recent Miyazaki film about the inventor of the Zero fighter plane? It's really good and it's really worth seeing. And Miyazaki is a really interesting person and a very thoughtful guy. And he made this one in 2013, I think it was, and it was supposed to be his last film. And he's a real, he would have thought about what his last film he wanted it to be. And it's funny because in much the same way that people in the West, in the press, saw everything with this latest Abe assassination through the prism of our own obsessions, the reviews of that film were, oh, it was an anti-war film. And, it's, talking about the horrors of war. And if you really watch the film, it's not an anti-war film. It's a film about, the victimization of Japan and sort of the tragic beauty of what Japan had to do. And even though they knew they were going to be destroyed, that there was a nobility in building the Zero and sending the kamikazes and attacking this much more powerful and unbeatable adversary. And a lot of the imagery of the film is sort of a premonition. They don't show it in the film, the dropping of the bombs, but there's a really famous scene where the main character in the 1920s is walking into Tokyo, and it's during the time of the Tokyo earthquake, and the whole city just ripples with, the shocks of the earthquake, and everything gets destroyed, and it's just havoc everywhere. And it's very clearly a premonition of what his work was going to bring on. Anyway, not to go down that rabbit hole, but it's just kind of an illustration of how that is the perception, I think, that Japanese have of themselves. And just another anecdote, I'm really friendly with a retired Japanese businessman who has connections with America, and that's how I met him. And when asking him about these subjects in the past, I was very surprised to sort of see what the mainstream view is among Japanese, that there's really no recognition that Japan did much of anything wrong in the past. It was more that Japan acted foolishly, or that there's a lot of justification in there, and a big blind spot, unless my understanding of what actually happened is completely wrong. And I just find that very interesting. And one of the things, we talk about Stephen Kotkin, who I really like, and his work on authoritarianism and the Chinese regime and Russia. And one of the lines that he uses a lot that I like a lot is he says, the fascism never went away. And what fascist states today have is they have stories of resentment, stories of national humiliation. And that is the most powerful tool in their toolkit against the liberal democracies, the truly liberal societies. And, I'm very bullish on Japan. I really like Japan. I think it's a very well-functioning society in so many ways. But I do see a blind spot there, that some of that is bubbling and could resolve itself in ways that people don't expect in the next 5 or 10 years. And I don't know where that goes or what it is, but I don't think the average person in New York or Washington, D.C. really gets that.
No, but I mean, I think in some sense, nobody gets Japan. I mean, I would say two things. The first is that Japan does not have, like Germany, has not looked at the sins of its past in quite the same way. Now, the reason there is so much support for the pacifist constitution and why Abe was not able to do it was because there is at least some reflexive sense that the guardrails were there for a reason. So even if it's not quite as present, Germany builds museums to the things that they did in the Holocaust and talks about it, animates them. They've been afraid to do anything for a long time. Japan doesn't have anything quite like that, but I do think there is some awareness of, there are some guardrails in place here. And if we go off, maybe we shouldn't get rid of the guardrails because the last time this happened, something bad happened. But I think you're probably right about the rest in terms of Japan's conception of itself in that regard. So, but this was the other thing I wanted to say, which is that despite all of that, I mean, I would call Japan a liberal democracy. I don't know if I would call it a liberal society. I don't feel like I know Japan well enough to say that. But as a government, I see no backsliding from even with this assassination, like elections went on as normal. There's no threat to Japanese democracy that I can read anywhere. And one of the things that I admire about Abe was the Quad was an idea of these democracies that share some semblance of these liberal values that have been so good to Japan since 1945 are worth defending. And Japan needs to be part of leading a coalition to defend exactly those values. So I think you're right that there is something bubbling in Japan, but it would kind of be ironic if the thing that is bubbling is a weird mix between all the things we talked about with Japan, but where the liberal democratic seeds that MacArthur planted in 1945, maybe they're there. Maybe that makes them the fiercest defenders of a global liberal order, which Japan benefited from arguably more than any other country in the world. I mean, they're right up there with the benefits that they got from the US-led world order and the unipolar moment. There's a reason they're the third or fourth largest economy in the world, whatever they are right now. So,
well, let me push back on that because, and I'm no Japan expert, but I think the counter argument to that would be, sort of the enigma of Japanese power type of argument, which is that the Japanese put in place, on top of structures that have existed forever in Japan, the sort of surface layer theater of many aspects of Western style democracy and American style democracy, but they never really took hold. I mean, yes, Japan is a democracy. It's had one party that's been in place for as long as anyone knows. Right.
I thought the wasn't there another opposition party that had a year in the sun there? Hold on, I got to Google that now. But
yeah,
I mean,
the Democratic Party of Japan had a very brief, but again, I'm not a Japan expert, and people are going to write in and say what an idiot I am. But my understanding was that there's not really any meaning to the DPJ was a rebellious offshoot of the LDP. It's not like, they split on necessarily very strong ideological differences or anything. Like the ideological opponents of the LDP were throttled or very early
but
on.
like it's even it's not like, I take your point. And I mean, Mexico is a good example of this too. Until very recently, Mexico sure was a democracy, but it was a single party, quote unquote, democracy. It was a single party dictatorship. And that's one of the reasons AMLO is so interesting. It's not that AMLO himself is the dictator. It's that he blew up the old system of Mexican democratic politics. And now you have all these parties. Now Mexico is probably going to be really different unless he manages to reshape it around him. So I take your point, but I think there is a big difference. Like the emperor's not the godhead anymore. Like we're not running around doing whatever the emperor says. The emperor abdicated because he was tired of it or whatever happened recently. So I think and this also gets back to a conversation about, the content versus the form. And at a certain point, the form actually starts to inform the content or the substance of what we're talking about. So I agree with you. The substance, the content of Japan, it's probably not right to call Japan a liberal democratic society the way that we think about it in the West. But the form of its politics is a democracy. And maybe they get rid of those guardrails. But it seems to me that, even in the context of the LDP, Shinzo Abe was the longest serving prime minister in Japan's history, but that was bookended by a period of intense instability within the LDP. So he gets elected for the first time, 06, 07, has a bunch of scandals, gets booted out of office. And then every single year until 2012, Japan has a new prime minister. So yes, they were all LDP politicians, I guess we could argue. I think maybe one wasn't in there. I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But
yeah, that was the year when the DPJ took it for a year or so.
But that's still a democracy. That's not, what happened in Japan in the 1930s and 1940s was the emperor was God. Whatever the emperor said went. The entire society was convinced it was winning the war right up until the moment where the emperor said, "Hey guys, sorry, we lost the war. I kind of have to stop it." Like that has changed somewhat. But I take your point about the substance. There is substance there that is not the same as the West. And I think Japan will behave in ways that is not similar to the West. But the form of their politics, it's not like China, for instance, where that's a real, technically China is a democracy too. They pay lip service to democracy all the time. But that's not a democracy. Japan, and it's a democracy. Call it a single party state, but even within the party, like they disagree with each other. They disagree with each other, and those things are there. So that's where I would land for now. But I think you and I both have more reading to do about Japan and visiting, hopefully, to do in the future. So.
Yeah, I hope so.
Unless listening to this has made every single potential Japanese host for us say, wow, these guys
I think we've managed,
have no clue.
Yeah. Our armchair philosophy. This is a generalist podcast. Maybe we'll have to bring on a Japan expert to educate us.
Oh, don't worry. I will. He's on the list. He's coming up soon. But in the meantime, we're back from vacay. We'll see you next week. Rob, good luck adjusting back away from the non-crepe, non-triple cream brie diet, and talk to you soon.
See ya.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.